studies fMRI and FNIRS. She's interested in studying mechanisms underlying individual differences in the way individuals interpret external situations and the role of synchronization in real-life interactions. So, thanks for coming.
So, thank you, Aya, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. I think the last time I was here, not here, but in ELSC was almost 7 years ago when I gave a job talk and I had a 3-month baby waiting for me outside, and I'm happy to say that now it's a bit less stressful than it was then. Okay, so the title of my talk is Neurosynchronization and Shared and Unshared Understanding. And a quote that relates to shared understanding is a quote by Henry David Thoreau, who said, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." And what I think he meant by that is that individuals perceive the world through their own subjective filters, their knowledge, their emotions, their beliefs, and these filters shape how they interpret what they perceive, how they understand the situation. I will today present studies testing whether shared understanding is associated with shared neural processing. And when I say shared neural processing, I mean as reflected by synchronization in the brain response between individuals. And I will mainly focus on 2 projects that we're currently doing in the lab that test these questions in an in-group, out-group context. You'll soon realize what I mean by that. So I would like to start with briefly describing a couple of studies that tested whether neural synchronization is associated with shared understanding when you understand a story versus when you don't understand it. So this study was done by Dan Ames at Princeton University together with Uri Hassan. And I want to give you an example from their stimuli in order for you to better understand what it means to listen to a story, understand the words, but having trouble to generate a narrative out of it. So now read a couple of sentences, and please try to generate a narrative. So kicking or stomping is usually required, both at the beginning and at the end. You should know relatively quickly if you need to do it, as things will feel all tilted and sluggish. Millions of people get professional help with this every year, but most people could deal with it on their own. If you have this problem, you almost certainly have everything you need to fix it. You need to get the right amount of elevation. Too little, and you won't be able to get the job done. But too much elevation can be dangerous, as everything can come crashing down if you're not careful. Anybody has an idea what is this about? Okay, you're in a good company. But if I would present this picture of a man changing a tire, it will help you understand what's going on here, right? So this is exactly what they did in their study. They, in half of the scenarios, they gave a picture that made it easier for people to understand what the piece was about. And in half of the scenarios, they gave a picture that did the opposite. So it's only made it harder for people to understand what it is. In terms of the brain response, so this is what you see here. It's a map of, do you see it good enough? Yeah? Okay. So it's a map where red voxels, it's an inflated brain, and red voxels are voxels in which the participants understood the story. They were given the right context, and you can see that these red voxels were synchronized among different participants. Blue voxels are voxels that were synchronized only in the invalid context, and the purple ones are voxels that were synchronized both in the invalid and in the valid context. So what I want you to take from here is that, for example, in primary auditory cortex, the response was synchronized no matter if the participants understood the story or if they didn't. Okay, as it was actually the same auditory input. However, in higher order regions within the default mode network, like the medial prefrontal cortex or the part of the precuneus, you can see that the response was synchronized only when participants understood the story. Okay, so, yeah?
Sorry, what do you mean by synchronized? I'm just trying to understand.
Perfect question. So synchronized is responding in a similar manner. Okay, so if you have a story, oh, I didn't mention that it's all in the fMRI, sorry. So all the studies I'm going to mention today were done in the fMRI scanner, and synchronized response is when a certain region or voxel, the time course of the region is similar from participant to participant. Okay? Good. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to ask during the talk.
It's similar, significant, or is there anything else?
So yeah, there is a threshold. I didn't want to get too much into the details, but I'll be happy to later. But there is a threshold that we just do like some kind of a permutation test to see what is the threshold for something to be significant. Yeah. But the idea is that in certain parts of the brain, for example, the primary auditory cortex, the response was synchronized no matter if they understood the story or not. And in certain parts, for example, parts of the default mode network, it mattered. So it was synchronized only that, you can say, in other words, you can say that understanding synchronized the response of these regions. Okay, so a couple of years later, during my postdoc, we tested not only if understanding synchronized the response, whether when you understand versus when you don't understand, but also if you understand something, you understand the story in two different ways, if it still synchronized the response in two different ways. So what we did is we presented 40 participants in the MRI scanner. We presented them a short story by J.D. Salinger, Pretty Mouse and Green My Eyes. And Salinger wrote it in an ambiguous way, okay? And we disambiguate the interpretation by presenting half of the participant with a context that we call the cheating context, and half of the participants with the context that we call the paranoia context. And what you need to know about it is that these contexts change the entire interpretation of the story. Okay, so now they both understand the words, they both can generate a narrative out of it, but the narratives that they generated are different, okay? And in terms of the brain response, what you see here, the yellowish orange patches, are patches in which the brain response of individuals that were presented with the cheating context was synchronized and different from the synchronized brain response of participants that listened to the story after being exposed to the paranoia context. Okay? And again, what you can see here, by the lack of yellowish patch in the primary auditory cortex, you can see that the response in the auditory cortex was synchronized no matter how they interpret the story. However, the response of regions within the default mode network, like TPJ, dorsomedial and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or precuneus, the response there was synchronized only within interpretation. Okay, so here, 4 lines of context that we presented before a 12-minute story were enough to align the response of participants that were exposed to one interpretation versus a group of participants that were exposed to a different interpretation. The last study I want to mention before I go into the main studies I want to tell you about is a study that tested not just if you understand versus when you don't understand, or when there are one of two possible interpretations, but actually when you can, let's see that it's working. Yeah. So when you have many different interpretations, like you can see here in this beautiful stimuli of shapes moving around, and each one can generate their own interpretation out of it. Okay, do you want me to give you so it's 7 minutes long, so I think I will end now, but you understand that idea. And what they found here, you want me to go back? So what they found was that inside the MR scanner, they were recorded while telling what they think happened in the story. And then using text analysis, the authors just generated a similarity matrix in the recall of what happened. And then they compared to the similarity in the neural responses. And what they found was that more similar interpretation was associated with more similar responses of regions within the default mode network, such as the TPJ or right angular, and the precuneus. Okay? So the take-home message from this study and many other studies done on this topic of shared understanding of relatively neutral narratives, okay, like the Salinger or the shapes moving around. So what they found is that shared understanding is associated with neural synchronization in higher order regions. Now, what we wanted to test is what happened in not in a neutral context, but in an in-group outgroup context when people come to the study with strong filters and opinions from home, and there's no need for an external context to shape their interpretation. I think one of the strongest filters that do exactly that, shape our interpretation, is political opinions. And in recent years, the political sphere is becoming increasingly polarized. And it seems that two different people may watch the same political debate or listen to the same political speech, but actually see and hear very different things. And when elections were declared in Israel in 2019, I thought it's a unique opportunity to test how the brain response is shaped by the political filters in real time. So what we asked is how political partisanship shapes brain activation and synchronization between individuals with similar and opposing political views. So based on the studies I mentioned before, that tested interpretation and comprehension of political and non-political stimuli, we hypothesized that we will see differences in activation and synchronization in higher order regions. Now, due to the fact that it was the first study testing this in a very vibrant political atmosphere that was occurring back then and still, we thought that maybe we'll see these differences even in early brain processing. So to test this, in a project that was bravely led by Noah Katabi, a master's student in the lab, 40 participants, 20 left wing and 20 right wing, came into the MR scanner just 3 weeks before the elections. So the elections were April 9th, and they came between March 18th and April 8th. And they watched eight movie clips, mainly political campaign ads. For example, you can see here a left-wing campaign ad, and you can see here a right-wing campaign ad. If you read the words, it's very sad to see it right now. Okay, so after each of the movie clips, so after each of the movie clips, inside the MR scanner, participants were asked 3 questions. How much did you agree with the main message of the clip? How much were you, how much did the clip interest you, and how emotionally engaged were you? And the participants rated it from not at all to very. After the scan, outside the scanner, they also answered a detailed questionnaire about each of the movie clips and each of the political figures that were in the clip. Now, as we were interested also in the dynamics of synchronization over time when interpretation might change, we decided we wanted to scan these participants again after the elections. So we waited for the elections to take place. We waited for a stable coalition to be formed. It didn't happen, so we scanned them again in July 2019. And this time, 24 participants came back, and they watched the exact same movie clips as before. Then, fortunately enough, we had in our IRB, we could scan them 3 times. So we waited for another election to take place and a stable coalition to be formed. Didn't happen. we waited for another election. This time, we waited for COVID situation to come down. And then after the fourth elections, in 2.5 years later, in August 2021, after Mמשלת השינוי, we scanned these participants again while they watched the same movie clips they watched in April 2019. Now, this paradigm allowed us to test both for differences in the brain response that stems from participants' political views, so left wing versus right wing, and also to follow the dynamics of the brain response over time, while there are shifts in participants' knowledge and emotional responses following events that occurred. We didn't know how many events will occur back then. So let's start with the first round, and this is the round that we finished analyzing the results and it was published. So in this round, we focused on 5 video clips. A neutral clip of a guy making a bus into his home, 2 political movie clips with left-wing content, a left-wing campaign ad, and a left-wing politician speech by Shelly Yafimovich. And we also had 2 political right-wing content with the Likud campaign ad and right-wing politician speech by Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, so let's start with the results inside the scanner, the behavioral results. Okay, so participants after each movie clip were asked how much they agree with the message, how much it interested them, and how emotionally engaged they were. So for the neutral clip, what you can see here, so the y-axis is the visual analog scale that for them was from not at all to very. In blue are the left-wing participants, and in red are the right-wing participants. And you can see that there was no difference in how much they agreed with the neutral main message. Not surprisingly, there was a very large difference between how much they agreed with the main message of the... So left-wing participants agreed with the left-wing campaign ad message, and much more than right-wing participants, and the other way around for the right-wing content. Now, what is nice about that, and I think it's due to the naturalistic settings, even though there was a large difference in how much they agreed with the message, all of them were very much engaged with it. It interested them, and they were emotionally engaged with it. Okay, so now let's see what happened in the brain. So what you see here in yellow, this is for the neutral clip, and in yellow you can see the boxes that were involved in processing the stimulus in both groups. Okay, and first by the lack of blue and red patches, you can understand that all voxels here were involved in processing the stimulus in both groups. So there were no voxels that were involved only in one group and not in the other. Okay, and just to give you a sense of what it means, so here are examples from 3 regions: the primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, and parahippocampus. The y-axis is the R value, the intersomatic correlation value, which is a measure of how synchronized the response was. And the dotted lines is the threshold that you asked before, what it means to be synchronized. So you can see here that both groups are higher than the threshold, and there is no difference between the groups. As for the right-wing campaign ad, what you can see here is that in addition to these yellow regions that were involved in processing the stimulus in both groups, there were some regions, these red regions, that were involved in processing the stimulus only in the right-wing group and not in the left-wing group. And interestingly, it included both regions like TPJ, which is part of the default mode network, which we anticipated, but also regions in the somatosensory cortex or in the premotor cortex that were involved in processing the stimulus only in the right-wing group and not in the left. And again, to give you a sense that it's a real effect, so you can see here in red the synchronization value in the right-wing participants, and in red and in blue in the left-wing participants, in each of these regions. in the right-wing speech, the speech by Benjamin Netanyahu, we saw a similar pattern in the sense that in addition to these yellow regions, most of the brain processes the stimuli similarly in both groups, okay? But in addition to these regions, we can see again these red patches in the SMA, in the motor cortex that were involved in processing the stimuli only in the right-wing participants and not in the left. And again, you can see that this is a relatively large effect, okay? As to the left-wing content, so there was a large association between the two stimuli that we gave them. We can discuss later why I think it was the case. And for the left-wing companion ad, which was a companion ad by Meretz, you can see that we see a similar pattern to the right-wing content in terms of that in addition to these yellow patches, we see red patches in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in the prefrontal cortex that is related to olfaction, in insula that was activated only in the right-wing participants and not in the left-wing participants. However, for the left-wing politician speech by Sheli Yachimovich, we see the opposite pattern, where in addition to these yellow regions, we also see blue patches that were involved in processing the stimulus only in the left-wing participants and not in the right-wing participants. So, to summarize this part, in terms of regions involved in processing the stimulus, we saw that the involvement of certain regions within the default mode network depended on the interplay between the political content and participants' political views. That is, these regions were involved in right-wing participants watching right-wing content or in left-wing participants watching left-wing content. And this is in line with previous studies that showed that the default mode network is involved in interpretation and comprehension of narrative. Surprising?
Yeah. You also have regions like the Salinger one where they're involved in both but different.
So we didn't test this in this project. So here we mainly tested whether regions were involved and whether one of the things that we saw is that, especially in the right-wing group, they were much more synchronized than in the left-wing group. So I will show you in a second. Yeah. So interestingly, here we found that there were differences in regions within the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the somatosensory. And we suggest that it was only in right-wing individuals that watched right-wing content. So we suggest that right-wing individuals use sensory motor or simulated representation to process right-wing political content. And we suggest that this representation facilitates identification with right-wing content in a similar manner to studies about, so for example, do you know these studies about the pain network where the pain network is activated when I watch in-group member suffering and it's not activated when I watch out-group member suffering? So maybe it just facilitates the what I need to do in order to identify with what I'm seeing. Okay, and now to kind of Ada's question, or the way I want to interpret your question. Yeah.
Can you go back one slide, please?
Sure.
So I see that in the, I think it was the left-wing speech, and you can compare it to the right-wing ad. We do have some areas that are the same, but generally it's not like the same areas light up regarding your agreement with this particular side. So what do you make of that?
That's true, but remember that it's hard to compare the regions between the stimuli, because for example, in the speeches, especially in Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, for example, it was him next to a podium, and maybe moving his hands a little bit. And in the campaign ad, it's you switch all the time scenes, and you don't expect the same regions to work. You understand what I mean? I mean, the comparison is between left and right wing to the same content, not between the different contents.
Yeah, but okay, because I guess what we would like to see is that the same area lights up for, say, for different people regarding on the content that they view.
Yeah.
But that's a bit different. Okay.
So I'm not sure I follow the question.
I'll ask you there.
Okay. Okay. So in terms of focusing on synchronization, so we wanted to test if we could classify participants' partisanship based on their synchronization with their in-group, okay, with their other in-group members. And for that, we used an SVM classifier, a very simple one. And we also did inter-subject representation similarity analysis, ISRSA, to test whether stronger political views were associated with higher synchronization. Now, if you have any questions about the technical details of, for example, ISRSA, I would be very happy to tell you all about it. I like this method very much, but maybe later. Okay. But the idea is that it can connect between behavior and the brain response in a naturalistic stimuli. Okay, so let's start with the classification. So what you see here is the different movie clips. So this is the right-wing campaign ad, this is the right-wing speech, this is the left-wing campaign ad and the left-wing speech. And the orange-yellowish patches are patches in which we could classify between 55 to 86% accuracy, but it was all significant after FDR correction, whether a participant opinions are left-wing or right-wing, only based on one value, okay? How synchronized they are with the other group members. And what you can see here is that there are many brain regions where we can do that. And I want to highlight that in addition to Purkinje or TPJ that are part of the higher order regions that we expected, again, we also saw the auditory cortex, pre-SMA, visual cortex, which was, we could classify participants' political opinions based on the synchronization response. So for example, in the SMA, where it is, I remember that here, the SMA had 86%, we were 86% accurate in saying whether a participant is right or left wing, only based on the synchronization of the response with the other group members. Okay. And in terms of the ISRSA, what we wanted to test here is whether the stronger any pair of participants' opinions are, whether it was reflected in increased neurosynchronization between these pairs of participants. So for that, what we did is we did a similarity matrix in the agreement with the main message, okay? So every square here is the average agreement of two participants. And this is for the 4 different movie clips. And then we did exactly the same for the neural response. So we correlated each pairs of participants' neural response in each voxel. And then we correlated between these two matrices, okay? So what you see here is that agreeing with the right-wing message, meaning agreeing with the right-wing message of the right-wing content, or disagreeing with the left-wing content, synchronize the response in many brain regions. Again, they included also primary sensory regions such as the visual cortex. And for example, here this region was the highest region. So this part of the primary visual cortex, the more two people were extreme in how much they agreed with the message, the more synchronized their brain response was. Okay, and what you can see here is agreeing with the left-wing message, and you can see that a striking dichotomy, okay? So, for example, agreeing with the right-wing message synchronized the brain response in many brain regions in these 3 movie clips, the right-wing campaign ad, the right-wing politician speech, and the left-wing campaign ad. and did not synchronize at all the left-wing participants. However, the last movie clip of the left-wing political speech did not synchronize the response at all of the right-wing participant, but synchronized the response of left-wing participants. So what you see here is the more extreme participants' behavior, the more extreme was their synchronization. So if I'll summarize this part, participants' political views could be classified based on the level of synchronization with their in-group members, and the stronger any two participants' political views were, the more similar were their brain responses. And again, interestingly, it was also in early brain processing. Okay, so now I want to move on to the second part of the experiment, which we are still, unfortunately, we're still analyzing it, even though the last count was in 2021. And this project is led by Gal Boyman, a master's student in the lab. He used to be here in the Hebrew University. And what he tried to do is to test whether what happened to synchronization over time. So within an individual that watched the movies in April 2019, what happened, how synchronized is the response to what happened in August 2021, and if it depended on changes in their interpretation over time. Now, as you all know, luckily enough, there was a lot of change, more than anyone could imagine during these 2.5 years. I just want to give you an example of watching the Yamin Hadash with Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett here when they did not pass Achuz HaChasima, and then 2.5 years later when Naftali Bennett was prime minister. Okay, so there's a large change, the same stimuli, large change in how the same individual will interpret it. So what we did here, first we tried to estimate how similar the brain response is between April 2019 and August 2021. And for that, what you see here is a distance map. So it means that red regions is more synchronized response, smaller difference, and brighter colors are higher difference, less synchronized responses. And what you can see is, for example, in the visual cortex and in primary auditory cortices, the response was pretty similar. However, in some of the dorsolateral frontal regions, and also, interestingly, the amygdala and hippocampus, these regions had a relatively different response. Now, what we wanted to see, if it's not just, first to second time, maybe it has something to do with, I don't know, signal to noise ratio, something. But we wanted to see whether this difference correlated with difference in interpretation. Okay, so for that, we had this very detailed questionnaire, and we estimated how different the interpretation was within each participant. And then we correlated it with difference in the fMRI signal, and this is what we got. Okay, so I don't know how familiar you are with intersubject correlation method, especially like in fMRI. We never get amygdala. And what you see here is beautiful bilateral amygdala and hippocampus, and part of the caudate region that over there, change in interpretation was associated in change in the neural response of these regions. Okay, so to summarize, this is
there any neutral control?
Yes. So what we did is, I'm not showing it here. We took the neutral, and then in order to have better voxels of interest, so we took only voxels that had significantly larger change in their response than what happened in the neutral, because we had this neutral condition. Yeah, that's a great question, because otherwise we don't know if it's something to do with watching it again. So, and also what we did, So again, if I'll continue with the Yamin Chadash example, so maybe some of you may relate to that, but I don't think that even in left-wing participants, I think the reaction, for example, to Naftali Bennett really changed on a personal note, but not in terms of ideology. So what we did, I'm not showing it here, but you can believe me. We divided the questions, like the change in interpretation score, to questions that had to do with ideology and questions that had to do with in-group, out-group. Okay? Because we asked specifically on each of the politicians, for example. And what we saw is that almost all of these regions were just about in-group, out-group. It was not about ideology. So the change in the norm response tracked the change in in-group, out-group feelings and not changing in ideology. Okay. So what we found is that the response of early sensory regions was synchronized across time and did not depend on individual's interpretation. However, the response of emotional, like amygdala, memory, and reward regions depended on changes in individual's interpretation over time. Now, okay, we're good with that. So now I would like to move on to another example that I think is very prominent in shaping our interpretation, and it's the tension between secular and religious Jews here in Israel. And I think that this tension was very much intensified due to political reasons in the last year and a half. So in two projects, we wanted to test the both in-group bias. Do you know, are you familiar with the term in-group bias? It's how much you prefer your in-group members, and neural synchronization in religious and secular participants. Actually, we also measured it in ex-religious participants. I'm not mentioning it here, but we have very interesting results, so if you want, I can tell you about them later. Okay, so let's start with the behavioral experiment. This was led by Nitai Kerem, that finished his master in the lab. And we wanted to measure both implicit and explicit in-group bias. So what is implicit in-group bias? It's how much you preferred your group, but we measure it not by asking you, but with a task. So one of the most famous tasks for measuring it is the implicit association task. And this was used for the first time in a religious context. So what you do here, the idea is that you have a word, and you need to as quickly as possible, say whether this word is religious or secular, or a different word, how much is it good or bad, okay? But you use the same keys. So the idea is that the more, let's call it intuitive association, so if you associate between religious and good, you'll be quicker in this pairing, and if you associate it religious and bad, you'll be quicker in the other pairing, okay? This is the idea. It is mainly used in the US and mainly in the context of racism towards black people. So this was the first time we did it in a religious context. And I will tell you the results quickly, but first I want to mention, in terms of explicit in-group bias, we just asked them on a feeling thermometer, on a scale of 0 to 10, how cold or warm do you feel towards religiosity? 0 being the coldest and 10 being the warmest, and also about secularity. Okay, so let's start with the less interesting result, which is the explicit bias. So you can see here the y-axis is the VAS rating between 0 to 10. And not surprisingly, you can see that both groups have in-group bias. Okay, so religious participants are more warm to religiosity and than to secularity, and the other way around for the secular participants. And when you look at it, you quantify it in absolute values, you can see that there's no significant difference, but if anything, on the explicit in-group bias, secular participants were more, had a higher in-group bias. Okay, but it was not significant. Now, in terms of the implicit in-group bias, what you can see here, the y-axis is the D-score, which is a measure of the implicit association test. So the dotted line here, 0, means no perforation, no bias. Dots above the line is bias towards religiosity, so religious and good, secular and bad. And lines below the line is bias toward secular and good, religious bad. Okay? And you can see here that both groups had an in-group bias, which is interesting because no one tested this before. But even more interesting is that the religious group in-group bias was twice as more as the secular group. And I can tell you, this is for Tzionut Datit, but we also tested this for Haredim in a separate group of participants, exactly the same. Okay, twice as much. I just want to tell you that in terms of the ex-religious, so in the explicitly, they were more similar to the secular, and implicitly they were more similar to the religious, to what they were, not to what they were. There was a question?
Just want to ask, how do you ask the question in Hebrew? חילוניות או חילונים?
שאלה ממש טובה. אני לא זוכרת, אני חושבת שחילוניות, אבל שאלה טובה.
Big difference.
There is, and also, it's not related to this, but I think it is interesting. There was a big difference. So I told you that the ex-religious group were more similar in term explicitly to the secular group and implicitly to the religious group, but in the ex-religious Haredim, it was not the case. And no, but what would you imagine? What will happen in the ex-religious?
Because, okay, it's more than ex-religious. It's in Sheila, so there are more like anti to the youth. So,
yeah, like it's from Haredi, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was exactly the case. And then we thought, okay, after being disappointed that we did not replicate this part, we realized that it could be something about that. Like we talked with ex-religious people, and we realized that it might be the case that it's different to, let's say, B'Sheila from the Tzionut Datit than from being Haredi. And then we saw that the implicit measure correlated with explicitly. We asked them how much, like with the warmth towards what they were. So it's very interesting, and it's exactly what you said. Yeah. Okay. So what we see here is that there is a big difference in the in-group bias between the two groups. And now what we wanted to do in a different project is test whether there's difference in synchronization within individual, parent synchronization within individuals that are religious versus secular. And for that, in a project that was led by Yochai Tzvi that just came back after 6 months in reserve, what we did is participants were in the MRI scanner and they watched 3 different movie clips. You can scan it here if you want to watch by yourself. One was a neutral video, a news report about the weather. After choosing this, we realized that it was not very neutral because it had COVID situation in it, so it's not super neutral. There was a chametz video about banning chametz in hospital during Passover. So how much I think that it's important to use ecological stimuli. I can tell you that it's a hassle because in the middle of scanning, Idit Silman left the coalition because of that. It was like, yeah. And then a kosher video about the danger of alternative kosher organizations. Okay, so this was more from a secular point of view, and this was more from a religious point of view. Okay, so this is an ongoing study in terms of the analysis. We finished collecting data. But what I show you here, this is for the neutral movie, for the kosher movie, and for the chametz movie. And in yellow are regions that passed the threshold. They were synchronized in both groups. In red are voxels, regions that were synchronized only in the religious group. And in blue are regions that were synchronized only in the left-wing group, in the secular group. And what you can see here is there are much more red voxels than blue voxels. And if we quantify it, you can see that there is between 12 to 15 times more voxels that were synchronized. So 12,000 here versus 1,000 in the religious group than in the secular group. And you can see that it's in many brain regions. So it's in early visual cortex, but also in the regions the TPJ and some precuneus. So we can see both in higher order and in early brain processing regions that there were voxels that were more synchronized in the religious group than the secular group.
But
So,
can I ask this
yeah,
one
sure.
thing? I mean, one parsimonious interpretation of this can be like the fact that the lives of religious groups are synchronized in some. So if you take, for example, secular basketball players, you might end up getting a very synchronized.
That's an interesting idea. I can tell you, I cannot reject that possibility, but I can tell you that in terms of their behavior, like how they answered, there was no less variability in the religious group than in the secular group. This is one thing. Second, we chose the Tzionut Hadatית, because these participants were Tzionut Hadatית, because we wanted people that are their orach chaim, their lifestyle is more similar to secular participants. Okay, I mean they are much more. There's much more intersection between the two groups, and I just want to tell you on a different note that the original idea was to have all groups, so to have also Chozrim B'Teshuvah, but we realized that there's almost no such thing as Chozrim B'Teshuvah Tzionut Hadatית. It's Chozrim B'Teshuvah to be Charedim, and then Charedim were not willing to participate in our experiment. So, but the idea was to have, it's like a very unique situation where you have symmetrical, right? There's no place other in the world that you can test this, but we couldn't find participants. So if you know anybody, let us know. So in my almost final slide, I want to summarize what we learned about neural synchronization and shared understanding. So we and others show that in a neutral cortex, like the Salinger story or the moving shapes, increased shared understanding was associated with increased neural response and neural synchronization in higher order regions, mainly within the default mode network. We showed that in an in-group, out-group context, like the left wing versus right wing or the secular versus religious, increased shared understanding is associated both with increased synchronization in higher order regions, but also in early brain processing. And we also have preliminary results suggesting that increased in-group bias is associated with increased neural synchronization. Now I would like to finish with raising some questions that I think that testing them will teach us a lot about the role of neural synchronization in shared understanding. So the vast majority of studies, including ours, tested neural synchronization when participants were lying by themselves in the MRI scanner. We used ecological stimuli, but still they were in the MRI scanner by themselves. And the synchronization was due to combination between the external stimulus and the interpretation of it. But I think that future studies should test neural synchronization in the context of real social interaction and track the patterns of synchronization as a function of the interaction. So, for example, in an extreme optimistic cases, what happened when pairs of individuals move from not agreeing with each other to agreeing with each other? Okay, and we're trying to test this in a current project in the lab. And also, I think we need to better understand if neural synchronization is more than synchronizing to the interpretation of external stimulus. And in order to do that, I think we need some kind of a test of the causal role of neural synchronization. So if we can increase neural synchronization, maybe by biofeedback, like neurofeedback, whether it will result in increased shared understanding. And I think that answering these questions can both answer basic science questions that I think are interesting, but also maybe open new pathways to promoting shared understanding, which is a very much needed process in our polarized world. And with that, I would like to thank you for that attention and thank all the people in the lab involved in these complicated experiments, and also thank the funding. Thank you. Question? Yeah.
Hi. I missed the beginning, so you might say. How do you control for other possible physiological synchronization, like, I don't know, hand movement, eye movement, heart beats, again?
Yeah, so actually for eye movement, I'm not sure if I want to control, I want to measure it. Because I think that maybe it starts at even an earlier. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question, and we try to measure the eye movements in the political project, and due to technical issues, we had only 18 participants, and we just did not analyze this data. But we do have a project that we want to test whether it starts already at where you look at and how you look at the stimuli. Okay, but the fact that we also have differences in the auditory cortex, I think it means that it's at least not just where you look at the stimuli. And measuring hands, actually, it's a great idea. We do it in projects where we look at the social interaction, but I never thought of looking at it when participants are in the scanner, because this could be super interesting. Because if our interpretation of some kind of a sensory motor representation, for example, in the right wing participants, so maybe when Benjamin Netanyahu shook the hand of India's prime minister, maybe we could see something, I don't know, in the movement. And I think it's a super interesting idea. So this is what I meant. I don't want to control, I want to measure where it starts.
It could be both, right? Some of them could be immediately an artifact, some of them can be part of the response.
Yeah, but I don't think it's an artifact. I mean, if the way let's call it the filter, if you're right wing and it makes you move your hand when you see Benjamin Netanyahu moving your hand, it's not an artifact. It's interesting. It's a...
Maybe when I'm straight, I'm just creating a fix. So, yes, you would see a motor response, but...
Yeah, but it's still interesting if all the group, this is what they're doing. But yeah, I agree that it will be valuable to test
my
this.
heartbeat just becomes faster because I'm stressed. For some reason, I don't relax.
Right, but then you would see it in some other measures, like in terms of what they say. But the main idea is that I agree with you, but I think it will be interesting to put it in some kind of a general model that will take all these components and test what is more important, for example, But even if it's true that they're just not looking at the same place, I think it's even more interesting than if it's just, we can say in a significant p-value that we can say based on the brain response in the visual cortex if they're left wing or right wing. It's more interesting if we can say they're just not looking at the same place.
So following up on the question, your answer. The big question is why the brain? I mean, why is it interesting to add the brain? I mean, you could say it's really interesting to look at in-groups and out-group behavior. People within the same group tend to behave the same way. They move their eyes to the same places, look at the same things, do things with their hands, get excited by the same things. All these kind of important social psychology questions. What is the importance? And of course, we all believe that our behavior is controlled by the brain, so there must be some kind of correlate in the brain to these similarities.
Yeah.
Where is the unique contribution of measuring the brain? For example, you emphasize the fact that it's in specific regions of the brain that you see some synchronization. So maybe this.
Yes. So you answered also your question, but yeah, the idea, I think, like if you would ask me this question a couple of years ago, I would say brain it's super important to understand which networks. Now I think it's important, but the behavioral data tell us a lot about what's happening. So I think measuring both of them is important. But in terms of your question of what the brains add, so I think, for example, this sensory motor presentation, which was really, really strong. Like if I need to say something about the political result, the thing that I believe mostly in what we saw is that these regions were activated in the right-wing group and were not activated in the left-wing group. And we could not know that. Maybe we could, because we did not record, but I believe that we could not know that. Like, you don't see it externally.
Which areas?
The sensory motor region. So I think these regions, or the brain, can also help us generate hypotheses to test behaviorally. But hypothesis that it would be very hard for us to think of if we did not see the brain results. And also, for example, in the ex-religious participants, the idea was to test whether they're more similar to what they were or to what they're not. If there's something privileged about first association, first thing you were born with. And I think this would be very hard to test not using neural synchronization. Yeah.
Do you see also effects of desynchronization with the opposite groups that aren't necessarily related to synchronization with your in-group? Because you could theoretically get farther away from your out-group in different directions.
That's very interesting, but I think in terms of the brain, it won't work. It's not, this we can test, for example, with facial expressions, and we have something like that. Like if someone is smiling, the other person is like, I don't know, fawn or something like that. But in terms of the brain, I don't know how to test this, because it's not like you expect the precuneus to go like this and in the left wing and then like this in the right wing. So it's really, really hard to define what is opposite directions. But I think in terms of behavior, it's really interesting to test this. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do we have time?
Sure, maybe.
Okay.
One last one.
I have more of a procedural question about the synchronization. So the idea is, so let's say you have 10 left-wing and 10 right-wing participants. So if you do a 20 by 20 correlation matrix of any particular brain region, let's say, would you see clear clusters in such a correlation matrix such that you can do these sort of within group synchronization studies?
You mean if I understand it correctly, if you create pseudo groups, like if you create a group, instead of 20 left wing and 20 right wing, you create 10.
Like, so, yeah, I mean, so let's say you have 10 left wing and 10 right wing, right? So that's 20 people total.
Yeah.
So if you do this 20 by 20 correlation matrix, would you see two distinct clusters? Because I think the cluster that you showed was based on behavior.
Yeah, you're right. But it was based on behavior.
Right, but on the brain level, would you see such
clusters? Yes, because not as beautiful as in the behavior, but the idea is that, if you remember the matrices, so there was a cluster here and cluster here, right, in the behavior. So the brain regions that you saw were the brain regions in which the neural synchronization between each pair, the matrix of neural synchronization, was similar. It was not the same, but it was up to 0.5 correlation between the two matrices. So yeah, you see clusters. You see, also in the neural synchronization, this is what
I see. So, I mean, so would that be construed as a justification for the synchronization measure? Because the other way of thinking about like a null model, I think this is probably what Marty was also referring to, was that you can just randomly divide your entire population into groups and calculate the synchronization within group.
This is exactly what we do in order to have the non-distribution.
Get the chance level?
Yeah, this is exactly what we do.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're right. It could be that by chance you have this group of people are more synchronized in this region than this group of people, but it does not. It has nothing to do with their political opinions or their religiousness. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
הזכרת את זה, אבל השאלה שהייתה לי, הזכרת את הסאמרי סטייל של האם יש קורלציה באמת, כמה יש בבייס, לדעת. תודה, היה ממש מעניין. אפשר לשאול משהו? בטח. היה איזה סלייד שהראיתי באמת פשוט בקבוצה של הילדים, אז משהו לא רואים שום. כן, בסוף, בסרטון, כאילו, אז היה שם נראה נכון. מה הסבר את זה? שאלה טובה. שישאול, אבל חשבתי אולי שזה לא מספיק טוב כדי לשאול לפני כולם. אם את יכולה להסביר, מה ההסבר?
אז אני חושבת, זה רק השאלה שעבר, אבל אני חושבת שההסבר, אחרי זה אנחנו כאילו, זה היה רק לפני מרץ, אוקיי? רק לפני מרץ? וזה חזק, זה היה חזק. ממש אינטנס, כאילו ממש. אז כנראה שזה קשור לדמות, זאת אומרת, אם הייתה דמות שהיא יותר קונצנזוס. אני לא יודעת מה להגיד, אבל אין לנו. תודה רבה. תודה, וששמעתי לך בפודקאסט של יארה, וזהו, ממש שמחתי לשמוע ובעיקר את ההשקפה על זה, שכאילו, פשוט שקל להסתכל על זה ולקחת את זה במקומות שליליים. נכון, זה מה שניסו גם כשהפוליטי פרסם, אז כל הזמן, כי זה עשה קצת הייפ כזה של פופוליסטי, אז כל הזמן ניסו לקחת אותי למקום הזה של מסוכנים, ואז חושבים כמו עדר, שמאלנים, אינדיבידואליסטים, אף אחד לא חושב אותו, כאילו... אז אני עכשיו שלחתי את הפרק לכל מי שאני מכירה, שישמעו גם, שאפשר להסתכל על זה בצורה אופטימית. נכון, תודה. טוב, תודה.
כן, זה היה לא נעים להרגיש שהראש שלי גם הולך לשם, כאילו שאני לא כזה, עדר, כזה די.
ברור, זה כאילו, אני עכשיו באמת לא חושבת ככה, חוץ מזה, זה גם לא עדר, זה פשוט שלימין יש דמות שהיא מסנכרנת, ולשמאל אין דמות שמסנכרנת. זה אולי השורה התחתונה של המצב בארץ, כאילו.
מעניין איזה דמות מאחדת, אפשר לחשוב על דמות מסנכרנת.
אני רציתי לשאול, יכול להיות שאני מניח משהו לעבור לגבי השלמות סינכרוניזציה, אם יש לכם איזושהי מידע על הזמן אופייני מתחילת לחס הפלסטים עד כניסה לסינכרוניזציה. הייתי משער הייתי משער שדבר כזה יהיה איכשהו קומולטיבי, אם אני אחשוף אחד מהנבדקים לאותו הסטימולי, לא משנה איזה מהם, עד שהוא יתחיל להראות סינכרוניזציה עם אותה קבוצה.
זה ממש מעניין, לא בדקו את זה, אנחנו בטוח לא בדקנו את זה, אנחנו עכשיו בודקים את זה.
כי אני משער שכשאתם עובדים, אני משער שאתם עושים איזשהו טיימסי כזה אנליסיס, ואתם...
ביי, תמיד לא חושב.
אתם רואים, פה התחלנו לחשוף את הנבדק, ואז אנחנו מסתכלים על הנקודה הראשונה שבה אתם רואים את אותו הסיקוונס כמו בנבדקים אחרים, נכון?
כן, בסך שלנו אנחנו יכולים לעשות את זה במדעת השעה. זה רעיון ממש טוב, אני יכולה להגיד לך שאנחנו עושים את זה עכשיו בניסוי EMG שיש לנו, ששם יש לנו רזולוציית זמן מטורפת של 4,000 הרץ, בניגוד לחברה שתזכור שהרזולוציה היא הרץ. זאת אומרת, יש לנו אחד. אז זה משמעותי לשאלה שאתה שואל.
אני חושבת שיש הזמן ארוך מלכתחילה.
אבל נכון, זהו, בגלל זה, אני חושבת שזו שאלה מאוד מעניינת. מה שאני כן עולה לי לראש, זה נגיד מחקר שעשו אצל אורי, שנתנו לאנשים לראות את, זוכרת איך קוראים לזה בעברית, טווילייט זון, כאילו אזור, איזשהו סדרת מתח כזה, ונתנו לאנשים לראות, כן, נכון? נתנו להם לראות, חלק ראו חצי פרק לפני, וחלק לא ראו את החצי פרק, ואז הם ראו את החצי פרק השני, וראו איזה מהירות אלה שראו את החצי פרק לפני, הם נורא מהר הסתנכרנו, ואלה שלא ראו לקח להם זמן. אז אני חושבת שזה יכול להיות, זו שאלה מאוד מעניינת. אני לא יודעת אם אנחנו באמת יכולים לבדוק את זה כאן. כי לא הייתה את המניפולציה הזאת, ואני תוהה, אני תוהה, אז בניסוי ההוא שאמרתי בטווילייט זון, זה ידע קודם הוא מה שהשפיע על הסינכרון. אז אני מנסה אחר אם יש לי השערה כלשהי.
אני לא בטוח שזה יהיה קודם, כי בסוף, בכל מערכת, כל רשת במוח, אם אני אחשוף אותה, היא שוכחת את המצב הקודם שלה, יש לה איזשהו סקאט זמן, היא שוכחת את המצב הקודם שלה.
אתה מכיר את העבודה שלו בחסן?
לא, אבל...
כי אתה שואל שאלות ממש מעניינות ממש מה שמעניין אותו.
תוכל לרפרנס אותי?
כן, אז תכתוב אורי חסון, זה URIHASSON, הוא בפרינסטון. הוא כיום לצערי כבר קצת עזב את התחום של FMRI, הוא עושה רק איקו, כאילו רק הקלטות מחולי אפילפסיה, אבל יש לו כמה מאמרים ממש רלוונטיים למה שאתה מתאר.
אז אורי חסון דבר לחפש...
ואז תחפש, יש לו מאמר ב-TICS, ב-Trends in Cognitive Science, הוא מ-2015. שם יש דברים שקשורים לעניין הזה גם של הממורי, שכאילו נגיד האודיטורי קורטקס יש לו, הסטנד סינכרון שלו הוא מאוד קצר, של כמה מילי שניות, ואז הולך ומתארך בעצם. זה לא באמת של מילי שניות, כי זה לא יכולו למדוד את זה, אבל הרעיון הוא שאם אתה משתמש בשיטה שלו של Inter-Subject Correlation, כדי להגיד, אם אתה לוקח גירוי ומסקרבל אותו, אוקיי? זאת אומרת, אתה לוקח נגיד סיפור אודיטורי, ומסקרבל אותו ברמת המילים, מסקרבל אותו ברמת המשפטים, מסקרבל אותו ברמת הפסקאות, כאילו משנה כאן בסדר, לאיזה אזורים אכפת מזה, אוקיי? אז זה ניסויים יפים כדי להראות את הרעיון הזה, שאני חושבת שזה קצת דומה למה שאתה אומר, של כמה זמן לוקח לך להיכנס לסינכרון. אז האודיטורי קורטקס ככה נכנס לסינכרון.
אני מכיר, כי זה מאוד הגיוני, ככה הדברים היותר גבוהים לא יקבלו את המידע בצורה מסודרת גם ככה.
יפה, כן, אז...
טוב, אין לי אינטלקט, אני לא יכול לעשות שום דבר.
אבל ממש מגניב שחשבת על זה בכלל, כי זה ממש כאילו... הדברים ש...
תודה.
אני סתם באתי להגיד אני חבר טוב של הרמה, פעם ראשונה שאמרתי כזה, אתה יכול לדבר, זה היה ממש כיף, סיפור מעניין.
רגע.
אני רותם.
רותם, אוקיי. לא, זה כי מבחינת יועד.
נכון, אני חבר מאוד טוב גם של יועד, אבל אני גם לא יועד, אבל אני הכל מאחורי הבדיחות קרש.
די!
כן,
איזה כבוד!
נעים.
וואו, ממש. רגע, אז אצל מי אתה?
אצל יואב אדם.
כן. וואו, גדול. אז כל הכבוד לך.
זהו, אמרתי, אולי זה יופיע היום, אבל בסוף.
כן, טוב, פעם הבאה אני אדע. גדול. טוב. נכון, אני זוכרת, את השם אני כל הזמן זוכרת, ובדיוק גידי דישון שהוא... נכון, פגשתי אותו. זהו, אז... שהוא בעלים, ואנחנו כל פעם אומרים על זה שאת לא מכירה, ואת לא קשורה לאורי קודודני, שזה הגיס שלנו. זה מצחיק, אני לא מפסיקה לשאול לא אותך ולא טוב. רגע, לך התחלנו? וואו. אני בין קוביות על זה שבועיים.
я не знаю, какая у них там ситуация. Он мне так, он мне не рассказывал, какая ситуация. Не могу знать. Нормально пока. Надо даже вопрос денег будет. Ты скажи, какая женщина не будет этого делать? Покажи хоть одну. Нет, наоборот. Понимаешь, она же получает хорошие деньги за ребенка. Израиль много кого ставит в такое положение. У тебя на Яндексе 7 почтовых ящиков. Тебе какой нужен? Я посмотрю, если ты его не поменяла, то где-то у меня должен быть, у меня вот этот список был. Да. Где там? Да. Я ж сюда хлеба хотел устроить. Ты не рассказывал? Ну, я ему помог написать резюме хорошее, его пригласили на собеседование. Вот. Но из-за того, что он не знает иврита, его, конечно, не взял. Нет. Сейчас грузчиком работает. Потому что деньги нужны, они же продали 2 квартиры в России, несколько курсов. На эти деньги жили год-два. Деньги закончились и пошел развод. Пока деньги были, развода не было. Как я понял, да. 2 квартиры продали, нет? Это 2, не помню. Не могу ошибаться. Что будет делать? Ну, как они ранее нужно по-другому знать. Не забыл, и более, и менее по-разному бывает. Сейчас пока нормально. Да. свиданием с другим мужчиной, может даже сексом с ним заниматься. Я, фу ты, бля, там обиделся, неделю с ним разговаривал. А выяснилось, она говорит, я хотела с тобой поговорить вообще о другом. Я, говорит, хотела поговорить, что ты типа потолстел, и мне неприятно, и надо тебе похудеть, чтобы у меня опять это. Я говорю, ну, блядь, ты нашла, как разговаривать. Случайно. Я не хочу. Да я вообще могу поработать. Да нормально все, дети ничего учатся. Вот, Соня очень хорошо школу закончила. Да, Савелий плохо, меня к директору вызывают в школу. Нет, он не хулиганит, он не хочет учиться. Просто не хочет учиться. Он хочет сидеть целыми днями, играть в компьютер, отдыхать, телефон. А учиться он не хочет, понимаешь? Мама все ему разрешает, я говорю, не бери с собой на мою компьютер. Она ему пусть берет, ему там делать нечего, он сидит, что-то не нравится, и уроки не делает. Да, вот 60 июля летит. Кстати, я с Наташкой вместе. Да. Он, конечно, приезжал тут на ночевку в гости. Вот. Я так не могу говорить, не могу ни с кем найти, с кем отправить ребенка. Так говорит, у меня Наташка едет. Ну, я так говорю, ну, а что ты молчишь? Давай быстро спроси у нее, возьмет она, не возьмет. Ну, она сказала, возьмет, что он уже взрослый, 14 лет. Они через Варшаву летят. Нет, не летят. Хотя мне тут, я хочу свой день рождения в Грузии отметить, где-то за границей, не хочу в Израиле. Я говорю, мы сейчас не можем себе это позволить. Я говорю, я хочу поехать куда-то, можно, говорит, я одна поеду с подружками. Нет, нельзя. Конечно. Все бывает, все обижается. Это не первая необходимость. Вообще. Уже даже то, что зарабатываешь в Израиле,